Hello and welcome back, sleepywhatsit here. Today for Miniatures Monday I have the first video in a 3-part series covering painting the Champions of Death, which are Games Workshop's new Blood Bowl team that I covered a couple weeks ago in a First Impressions video. This first video will be walking through the steps I go through to prepare Blood Bowl miniatures, since I haven't covered my specific process in a previous video for miniatures in general, and Blood Bowl miniatures have some additional steps specific to them that I want to cover at least once. The two videos that will follow this will cover actually painting the models. The first of those two videos will cover the lineman models in the set, so both of the skeleton types and both of the zombie types. And the third video in the series will cover all of the positionals, so your wights, your ghouls, and your mummies. In this video, I'm specifically going to be covering how I magnetize my teams, doing a little bit of gap filling, focusing on those large slots that are open on these models, and then showing the process I go through for zenithal priming my models. I won't be covering the assembly of these models. In theory, that should be part of the first impression video, and I do give some hints or tips on how to do that, but assembling these models was mostly just cutting out the sprues and then gluing them together. So let's get into it. So the first step in preparing our models will be to magnetize the balls so that we know the orientation that we need to magnetize the models to. And the first thing we have to do for that is to remove this little peg that we have here on the bottom of the ball. This can be easily achieved by taking a pair of plastic clippers and just snipping it off the ball like you would like any other part of a sprue. The next step of the process will be creating a pilot or a little divot in the ball for where we're going to be drilling in to make space for the magnet. Here I do this with the tip of my hobby knife, which is probably not the best for my hobby knife, but I have a lot of extra blades. But you could also do this with a punch or a quick turn of a small drill bit. Now onto the next step of actually drilling into the bottom of the ball to seat the magnet. We have some high-speed footage of me using a pin vise to do this. I would recommend using a hand tool of some sort to do this as opposed to a power drill or a Dremel, because otherwise you're going to just tear through the ball and probably hurt yourself. As we go, we clear out some of the material and then we check that the magnet fits. This may require multiple goes. Once we have it fitting, we pop it in, place some CA glue on the bottom of the base, letting the capillary action pull the glue in around the magnet to hold it in place. While we wait for this glue to dry, we'll move on to prepping the bases for having magnets put into them. The magnets I use are cheap 2mm disc magnets I get from the local surplus supply store, so I don't have a good online retailer to recommend for these. As you can see here, these magnets don't fit exactly into the bases yet, though they're very close. So we're going to have to drill out these holes a little bit so that we can drop the magnets in. So taking my pin vise again, actually using the same drill bit that we were using on the ball, we just run it through the hole a little bit to get out the excess material so we can fit the magnets in there. When choosing a drill bit size, I would recommend not taking too large of a drill bit because the magnets will tend to fall through otherwise. If you see here, as I pass the drill bit through, I'm not actually taking out much material at all. Realistically, I'm just kind of pressing the plastic so I can drop the magnets in. So now we're going to move on to actually installing the magnets. And while doing this, we have to pay very close attention to the polarity of the magnets and how they react with the balls. So if they're same pole together, or opposite pole together, they stick together, same pole, they push away from each other. Because of the fact that the way we're going to be installing this is basically putting it on the blade of the knife and putting it in upside down relative to the knife blade, what we actually want facing up on the knife blade is the same pole, because that's what's going to be facing down into the base. So what we can see here is what we want. The effect here is where the magnet is being pushed away from the ball, so that when we put it into the base like this, the side that will be facing upwards will be attracted to the ball. As you can see here, it flipped around a little bit, so I'm just going to recheck it to make sure that I have the right pole facing up, because I have screwed this up many times before, and it's really frustrating to have your balls the wrong, not sticking to the bases. So we pop it in, we start sliding the blade off. We use our thumb to hold down the magnet so it doesn't, because it's going to want to follow the blade. So now we have the opposite pole facing up, and our magnetic ball here just kind of pops on. So you can see here it's snapping on. We want to check this every time before we glue anything in, because getting this stuff out once you have glue on is nigh impossible. You just basically have to drill it out, to be honest. So now that we're confident it's correct, we drop in a little bit of CA glue here to secure it into the bottom of the hole. There's two basic problems that you can encounter when doing this. The first one here, you're going to see it's a little bit out of frame, but this one I drilled a little bit too wide, so when I go to drop in the ball, or drop in the magnet, bloop, it falls right out the bottom of the base. This is minorly frustrating to deal with, but we can deal with it pretty easily. So what we're going to be doing here is dropping in a little bit of CA glue into the hole before we put the magnet in, letting it cure just a tad, so it's a bit tacky, so it's not just runny, which honestly, picking up the magnet again is going to be enough time to get it to be a little bit tacky. So once we've put the glue in, put it away, pick the magnet back up, test it against the ball to make sure we're orientated correctly, do that slightly out of frame, because I'm really bad at doing film. Pop the magnet back in. Now the glue, because it was a little bit tacky, should keep it from falling through again. Seat it correctly, and then we're going to just drop in a bit of glue like we normally would. The other issue that we might encounter, which we see on the other ghoul here, is where it doesn't seat in all correctly. So to push it in, as opposed to using your knife or something, you can just use a plastic base that you have sitting around to make it go flush. Normally you should be able to just use your thumb to push it in and make it go flush. As I said, sometimes it doesn't exactly go in, so I would recommend using something non-magnetic so you don't just pull the magnet back out afterwards. Now we're going to move on to filling in the slots. I'm going to be using Milliput, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. Other 2-part epoxy putties are available. I'm personally actually pretty preferential to using green stuff. I just used Milliput for this one because it happened to be probably easier at hand. Honestly, I kind of hate how Milliput gets everywhere. Being a 2-part epoxy putty, you cut off a chunk of each part. Realize you're cutting on your good mat and should be using a cutting mat for this, but continue on with your life. So you get both, you get a chunk of both, so you have a white and off-white in this specific type of Milliput. Try and get it approximately the same size since it's supposed to have a 1-to-1 ratio. Take the 2 parts and now work them together. Part of the reason I like green stuff more is because it turns solidly green once it's ready, because it's yellow and blue. Also, I find just working with it is a little bit nicer. This is actually probably the last project I'm going to do with Milliput, because as I said, you can see the white that's getting everywhere is very frustrating in some of the process, or some of the way it works I'm not a big fan of. So you get out your favorite sculpting tool. I'm a big fan of this one, a little one with a scoop on the back and a pointy V-shaped tip that I use kind of for everything. You take a bit of the putty that you have, roll it into a bit of a cylinder shape. You're going to force it into the bottom of the slot with your fingers. As always, just slightly out of frame. Use your tool, push it in a little bit, trying to get it fill in the entire slot as you go along here, which you can't see really well. Briefly see that it's they got our cylinder kind of wedged all the way across, using the pointy bit to push it all the way to the corners and edges. And what we're then going to do once we have it kind of worked in there is use the point to clean it up a little bit, run it through the putty to push it all the way through, because we actually want the putty coming a little bit outside the slot. And then, as you can see, I'm just drawing a kind of a V there. So now that we have it pushing through all the way, we can then take the kind of blade edge of the tool and scrape off / smooth out the putty that's facing on the top. Because of the fact that we're going to be putting basing material on this later, after we have everything painted, I'm not super finicky about how clean it is. I'm mostly going for trying to get enough putty on here that it completely fills the gap. I know there are other techniques using foil tape and such to fill gaps like this, but honestly, for the price of putty, I'm normally doing other gap filling, so I have to wait for it to cure anyway. I'm totally happy to just use this to fill it. I also force a little bit into the little divot that appears in the Blood Bowl bases that you get from Games Workshop. just so that we don't have to fill that up with basing material later. Smooth it out a little bit using the flat edge of the tool a bit. As you can see how this is kind of smearing, getting everywhere is another property that I don't like about how Milliput works relative to green stuff. I find it has almost like a cream cheesy-esque consistency where it kind of smears over surfaces when you try and spread it, as opposed to going smooth. Again, we run the tip through to create that V. That's mostly just get excess material out at this point so that we're not completely filling the slot and using up a ton of putty just to fill in all these slots. We have this little, so we're kind of just, as I said, pushing through, creating a little V in the backside of the slot, getting the excess material out so that we can use it for the rest of our project. And because we pushed through on the bottom here like this, we'll just have to do another pass on the top to smooth it out. This goes a little bit cleaner than the first pass just because we have enough material, so we just kind of shear it off and continue on. As I said, with green stuff, this is a little bit neater, but overall, this I think worked perfectly fine. When working with epoxy putties like this, you should regularly wet your fingers, wet your tools, because that will keep it from sticking to them as much, and it generally allows it to be a little bit more workable. This works really well with green stuff. Not a big fan of Milliput because you end up with a lot of white film on everything, and it's just kind of a pain in the arse to clean up afterwards. I also did some gap filling on the models themselves, where the pieces themselves, like on the mummies, didn't fit together exactly correct. Unfortunately, that seam filling, the recordings that I did of it is blurry, out of focus, and just generally unusable, so I'm not going to show it here. I did do all that work with green stuff because I'm more comfortable with how green stuff works, how the properties of it work. There's brown stuff, there's other types of Milliput. Basically, it's any type of two-part putty epoxy is what you want to be working into those gaps and smoothing out with the tool so that you fill in the seams. After magnetizing all the models and puttying them, we're going to have to let them sit for a while to let the putty cure. Depending on the putty that you're using, this can take between a few hours and an entire day. So once that's cured, we're going to come back to them. What we're going to do next is clean everything up. So we're just literally going to put in some warm soapy water, brush it off lightly. This is going to get any oil that's gone from our hands onto the models off. It's going to get any stray putty off the models, and it's going to remove any mold release agent that might be still remaining from the manufacturing process. This is something I recommend doing with every model before you prime or paint it, just because of the fact that, especially that mold release, is going to completely screw up your paint job if you don't deal with it beforehand. As I mentioned before, I like doing a zenithal shading prime on my models. So this is where we're going to lay down a dark layer on everything, then come from 45 degrees above, bringing a mid-tone layer, and then from directly on above, bring our highest, brightest layer to the paint prime. I do this all with primer. Technically, only the first layer that covers everything needs to be done with primer, so you could do the first layer in primer and do the other two layers using a regular paint. I just happen to use primer because sometimes I just prime models solid colors, so I have a lot of different primer kicking around. As I also mentioned, I do this with an airbrush. You can do this with rattle cans, or you can do this with brush on primer by brushing on the base coat or base dark layer and then using dry brush to establish those other highlights. I primarily use an airbrush because I have one for working when it's cold and humid and dry and all sorts of weird weather that you get in, where I live. So often rattle cans are very temperamental. You can work around this somewhat by making sure they're warm and such, but I find the consistency that I get out of the airbrush combined with the control I get is really worth it for me. So the first thing we'll be doing is laying down the base layer of black Vallejo primer on this model. So we're going to get this everywhere on the model, covering all the plastic, making sure that there's no gray showing through. This establishes the entire base coat so that we don't have to worry about when we put acrylic paint on later it not adhering correctly to the plastic. The next layer we're doing was with the gray Vallejo primer. So this is going to be shot in at a 45 to 60 degree angle from above. And so this isn't going to be a complete coating like we saw with the black, but it is going to be still covering the majority of the model. So what we want is basically anywhere where light is falling, you would expect light to be directly falling on the model should have this a gray on it. Any of the shadowed areas may remain black, like you can see in between the bandages and like on the underarm, they still pretty black, but basically anywhere where light is going to fall on it should be gray. And we're going to finish this off with white Vallejo primer from directly on above, so basically holding it relative to the airbrush so that I can see the circle of the base square on, using just a little bit of this, not putting a ton of it on, because what we're trying to do here, as opposed to coating kind of from the top everything in a solid white layer, it's just kind of hitting any of the high raised areas where there's going to be a lot of light catching, and it's going to be your hot spots, as it were, in your shading with white, so that we can have a differentiation between the kind of lighter gray tone everywhere and the bright white. With these models, I didn't go back in with ink to establish anything. I liked how the prime came out, honestly, and mostly I just wanted to get... So that concludes all our preparations for painting. In this video, we've covered magnetizing the models, filling all the gaps in the slots on the models, and priming them for painting. In the next video, we'll be doing the painting of the linesmen, so that'll be all the skeleton and zombie models. And in the third video, we'll finish things off by doing all the painting for the positional models, which will be the wights, the ghouls, and the mummies. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it informative or entertaining, please give the video a like. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to the channel. If you know anyone that would be interested in this or would find it informative, please share it with them. And if you have any questions or comments on the video, please put them down below. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.